In a Eurocentric viewpoint of performance history, it is often said that during the period of the 5th century to the 10th century there was a so-called theatrical Dark Ages. In reality, what occurred was a shift of the cultural center of the world from the Mediterranean to the east across the Silk Road into what was then Chong'an, the capital of the Tang Dynasty. It is here that many of my ancestors would enjoy plentiful leisurely activities for the abundant wealth gained through control of the Silk Road in a time that would come to be known as the International Golden Age, the age of 1,000 entertainments. But what if I told you that the fall of the Tang Dynasty can be traced back to a single dance? My name is Daniel Lee, in Cantonese Lei Wangyan, and I am the son of 2 immigrants from China who fled due to the one-child policy and to further their studies, a second-generation immigrant if you will. On both sides of the family, my lineage can be traced back to the Tang Dynasty, a period in Chinese history of great prosperity and cultural growth. During the Tang Dynasty, the ruling family held the surname of Li, which came to be adopted by many families around the capital. These families would mainly live around the Yellow River and its tributaries, and would remain there for centuries. That is, until the 11th century, when the Mongols would push in from the north and displace millions of Lis from their homes. Moving forward to the past century, my parents would find themselves both immigrating to Canada for study and to avoid the one-child policy at the time. With that said, let us turn back to the Tang Dynasty in order to look at one of the performance traditions that would subtly define an era. How exactly is it that the Tang Dynasty would go from the world's most powerful economic and cultural center into effectively a state of ruin? The answer can be found in the leisurely activities of the Li emperors, specifically Emperor Xuanzong, his most favorite concubine Yang Guifeng, his trusted general An Lushan, and the curious case of the Sogdian world. Before we continue, let us take a look at the pertinent political, cultural, and economic factors of the Tang Dynasty. To understand the Tang Dynasty in a general term, it is important to understand why the Tang Dynasty was so powerful at the time. Of course, the question must be asked, why was this? The answer lies in trade. This is a map of the international trade routes under the Tang Dynasty, otherwise known as the Silk Road. Following the conquest of several Turkish tribes to the west, the Tang Dynasty would effectively grow their sphere of influence to control the Silk Road with its exports of spice, timber, and silk. Notice the location of Chong'an. As the end of the Silk Road, Chong'an was one of the many centers of economic trade at the time. These factors would allow for 3 important points of the Tang Dynasty to rise. 1. It was a time of economic prosperity. 2. It was a time of relative peace. And 3. It was a time of great cultural exchange. The hordes of merchants that would pass through Chong'an would also bring numerous performing troupes of dancers, actors, circusry, and more. This would be the reason why the Tang Dynasty would be given the title of the International Golden Age, the age of 1,000 entertainments. In general, the government was welcoming of the material and cultural goods being imported into the empire. In fact, their openness would lead to Buddhism being one of the dominant religions of China, to the point that it was added to imperial exams at the time. However, an excess of trust would unfortunately lead to the fall of the Tang Dynasty. Of the many cultures pouring into Chong'an, the Sogdians, along with horses, gemstones, metalwork, and furs, would bring fashions, dancers, musical traditions, and religions. Most notable and relative to the Tang Dynasty would be the religions of Buddhism, Christianity, Manichaeism, and the performance traditions of the Sogdian world. Take a moment to observe this image of 2 female Sogdian dancers. Notice the lifted right leg as well as the flowing ribbons characteristic of the dance. The Sogdian whirl was a dance typically performed on a small, rounded carpet by both male and female Sogdians. Males would typically wear thrown-open clothing consisting of 2 lapels on the kaftan, while females would wear trousers on their short dresses. Further, notice the long sleeves, which help illustrate the movement of the dance, as well as the pointed cap and double gourd on his back, which are part of the dancing costume. Typically, the dances were performed to music from lutes and flutes and would consist of leaps and whirls. However, the specific steps, movements, and music of the dance are lost to time. That said, Sogdians would come to perform this and other dances in and around the cities of the Tang Dynasty as they moved across the Silk Road to sell their goods, often in exchange for their precious silk. The dance would be displayed as a form of entertainment for both the Li emperors and the general public that could be seen whenever Sogdian traders arrived from the west. For the Sogdians, the Sogdian world was a cultural export, which allowed them to forge key relationships with general populations and the nobility, while for the audience of the dance, it was an entertaining, leisurely activity that bedazzled any and all. Now that we have an understanding of the Tang Dynasty and the Sogdian world, let us examine the culmination of the collision between these two. Following centuries of rule by Li emperors, the succession of the throne would be given to Li Longji, after his father, Emperor Ruizong, abdicated the throne in 710. Li Longji would take the name Emperor Xuanzong, and in the first half of his reign it is said that he brought the Tang Dynasty to the height of its power and culture. To fully understand the next part of the story, let us first examine a poem titled Iranian Whirling Girls, written by Po Chu-yi, based on historical records of the Tang Dynasty. The poem describes how, in the 730s, Emperor Xuanzong would encounter Yang Guifei, who stole the ruler's heart with her Husuan Wu. In other words, he too would be charmed by the Sogdian world. This event would lead to a series of catastrophes that would bring Chong'an to its knees. Xuanzong's obsession with his new lover would lead him to largely abandon his duties. In doing so, he would effectively hand his powers over to Li Linfu, a corrupt official. Xuanzong's interest in the dance would also lead him to trust An Lushan, a Sogdian Turkic general who would penetrate deep into Xuanzong's inner circle due to his expertise in the dance. An is described in a poem translated by Victor Meyer as having entranced the ruler with his Sogdian world. Throughout this time, the Tang Dynasty would experience a slow decline as numerous corrupt officials would be promoted by the hand of Li Linfu. At the suggestion of Yang Guifei, An Lushan would be appointed to a high position in the military. Xuanzong's trust in An Lushan would eventually lead to the Sogdian general gaining enough power to launch the An Lushan rebellion in the winter of 755, which would become proportionally among the deadliest atrocities in human history. It is estimated that 13 to 36 million people died due to the An Lushan rebellion. This number represents around half of the people in the Tang Dynasty Empire. All this because of the Sogdian world. In the end, the An Lushan rebellion would fail due to a combination of infighting and the rise of Xuanzong's son, Suzong. But the Tang Dynasty would never recover and eventually fractured into the 5 dynasties, 10 kingdoms period. With all that said, it is important to contrast the decline of the Tang Dynasty with the extreme amount of welcoming that the Tang Dynasty gave to other cultures which enabled its prosperity. At the time, the chief religions were Taoism and Confucianism. The belief in the Tao, or the Way, encouraged policies of non-intervention, which enabled the relative freedom of movement. Through the cultural exchange caused by the Tang Dynasty's policies, a huge amount of knowledge and inspiration would be gained by the artists of the time. A plethora of art in the form of poetry, prose, and painting would be produced during the Tang Dynasty, which would later inspire a myriad of adaptations and works created in the Song Dynasty and in modern Chinese operas. The total amount of works created and preserved during this time are immense, as over 48,900 poems by 2,200 Tang poets have survived. Notable figures remembered for their works include Bai Zhuyi, Wang Wei, and Li Shangyin, each of which were inspired by the unique hodgepodge of mercantile trading, religious missionaries, and novel aesthetics created by the mix of cultures. All of this is in sharp contrast to the later years of the Tang Dynasty, when the focus and obsession over the singular Sogdian world would lead to the decline of the empire. Ultimately, what made the Tang Dynasty so powerful was not the focus on the Sogdian world, of the one, the lavish and the corrupt, but rather the focus on the many. The Tang Dynasty flourished on the acceptance of all cultures from the world over, from Buddhism to Zoroastrianism, and benefited from the plethora of values and lessons to be learned from them for the cultural exchange that occurred. However, despite the clear impact and importance it had in performance history, it is largely forgotten or left undiscussed. Even Ryerson's very own THF 200 silently swept the Tang Dynasty under the rug, labeling it as a part of a theatrical dark age. It is true that the Tang Dynasty pales in comparison to the gargantuan that is the Greco-Roman period, but it is still most certainly a key period of the timeline that continues to influence performances today. At the very least, it should be mentioned that it exists, if only in passing. Regardless of its stature, it is still clear that given the cultural moment we find ourselves in today, we can learn from the attitudes of the Tang Dynasty. As we examine the racial, social, and political divides that we face today, we may find that using a similar attitude of acceptance is helpful in understanding one another. And as we recognize the flaws within our systems, we may find that straying away from an obsession over the singular is needed in order to succeed in dismantling these flaws.